2 weeks ago, brought a lesson about what Jesus said concerning Jerusalem's fall. This lesson is picking back up at the tail end of that lesson to go into detail, some detail, not by any means all detail, given to us by the historian Flavius Josephus. Oh, left my glasses down here. Man, those glasses. You may remember Flavius Josephus was a Jewish general. He surrendered his forces to the Romans at the siege of a city called Jotapata, and the Roman commander Vespasian made him a historian in his service. Jesus said Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed within the generation of the people that he was talking to. That's Matthew 23 and 24, said it twice. And he foretold the destruction, warning specifically of great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. In other words, when we look for an example of absolute tribulation, of trouble, of horror, we'll look at Jerusalem. Nothing before that time was as bad, and Jesus said nothing after this time will be as bad. And you know as well as I do that there have been a lot of bad things in history. Jesus also said that the gospel would be preached to the whole world before all of this happened. And then Paul wrote in Colossians that the gospel had been preached, and that was by about the year AD 60. So that was fulfilled. And then in AD 70, Josephus recorded Jerusalem's destruction and the absolute horror that befell its citizens. One of the reasons this is unique is because no other city's fall has been recorded in detail like Jerusalem's has. Why is that? A lot of cities have fallen, but Jerusalem is the city, had one of its native sons to record what happened in and around this town while it was taking place. And this is the city that Jesus said would be the city where great tribulation would take place like the world has never seen nor ever would. There is a bust of Vespasian. Nero sent Vespasian to quell Jewish rebellion in AD 66. Cities and villages fell to him throughout Judea as he made his way towards Jerusalem. So as he's coming into the country, as like he would come in from Arkansas here, and he might take Henrietta, and he would take Salisaw and all those other cities out to the east, and he'd be coming towards us, and word would be coming to us, hey, he's coming, he's coming. So refugees from all quarters fled to Jerusalem, swelling its population. Jerusalem was a fortified city, a large fortified city with a water source and food stores, so that's why people were going to Jerusalem. Well, some of the reason. All quotes that will follow are from the works of Flavius Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, and the quotes will be referenced as follows. If you'd like to look those up, book, chapter, and verse. There'll be 3 numbers after each quote. The first number is the book, the second number is the chapter, and the third number is the paragraph in that chapter. So you can find these very easily if you want to research this for yourself. In the village of Gischala at Vespasian's coming, a fellow by the name of John fled. It says, however, there were a great number that belonged to a band of robbers that were already corrupted and had crept in among them, and some of the governing part of its citizens were sick of the same distemper. What does that mean? This is how Josephus writes. You gotta interpret some of the things he says. He's saying that the leadership in town was just as corrupt as these robbers. So he says it was John, the son of a certain man whose name was Levi, that drew them into this rebellion and encouraged them in it. In the nighttime, when John saw that there was no Roman guard about the city of Gischala, he seized the opportunity directly in taking with him not only the armed men that were about him, but a considerable number of those that had little to do, together with their families. He fled to Jerusalem. So he gets to Jerusalem, and upon John's entry into town, the whole body of the people were in an uproar, and 10,000 of them crowded about every one of the fugitives that were come to them and inquired of them what miseries had happened abroad. They know Vespasian's coming, they know towns and cities are falling, and they want to know what's going on, what's happening out there. You guys are coming from that part of the country, and we want to know what news you have of what's happening with the Romans coming. John's influence over the Zealots. There were already a group in Jerusalem known as the Zealots. You might remember one of the apostles was a zealot, and there were several of those. They were political patriots. They believed in Israel as a nation, and they wanted Israel to rise again to power. And so he's with this group of people. John went about among all the people and persuaded them to go to war by the hopes he gave them. He affirmed that the affairs of the Romans were in a weak condition. Sure, John, that's why you fled the Romans and came to Jerusalem. That's the way liars do it, though. And he extolled his own power. Hey, I'm your man. You want to fight the Romans, I'm the guy to help you do it, even though I ran from them when they came to Gischala. He also jested upon the ignorance of the unskillful, as if those Romans, although they should take to themselves wings, could never fly over the wall of Jerusalem, who found such great difficulties in taking the villages of Galilee and had broken their engines of war against their walls. So he's a bodacious liar, and people are sucking it up. These harangues of John's corrupted a great part of the young men and puffed them up for the war. But as to the more prudent part, and those in years, older guys, there was not a man of them but foresaw what was coming, and made lamentation on that account, as if the city was already undone. Now the Roman garrisons stationed in the surrounding towns, because Rome was already in control, basically. Rome was in control, and they had garrisons stationed in all the towns, but the Jews rebelled. So those garrisons, instead of trying to fight the Jews, they said, well, let's just draw in here, let's stay where we are, and we'll keep ourselves safe, and we'll wait for Vespasian to come. So they did little or nothing towards relieving the miserable, the regular citizenry, fighting the rabble outside, till the captains of those troops of robbers, being satiated with rapines in the country, got all together from all parts and became a band of wickedness, and all together crept into Jerusalem, which was now become a city without a governor. These very men, besides the seditions they raised, were otherwise the direct cause of the city's destruction also. For as they were an unprofitable and a useless multitude, they spent those provisions beforehand, which might otherwise have been sufficient for the fighting men. Keep in mind, Josephus is writing after the fact. Everything he's going to write about has already happened. So as he starts talking about what these guys do, he's telling it, these guys are the reason Jerusalem fell. There were besides these other robbers that came out of the country and came into the city, and joining to them those that were worse than themselves, omitted no kind of barbarity, but proceeded as far as murdering men, and this not in the nighttime or privately or with regard to ordinary men, but did it openly in the daytime. Josephus gives us a picture of a crowd of thugs and robbers coming into town, so numerous and so powerful that they just decided, well, we'll be the law here, we'll just do what we want. And that's what the citizens of Jerusalem had to tolerate for some time. The grand lying pretense these men made for so flagrant an enormity, the killing, the murdering of people in the daytime, was this, that these men had conferences with the Romans for a surrender of Jerusalem to them. And so they said they had slain only such as were traitors to their common liberty. Upon the whole, they grew the more insolent upon this bold prank of theirs, as though they had been the benefactors and saviors of the city. They come in and they murder people, and they know they have to give the regular citizenry some reason for that. So, well, these guys were going to turn us all over to the Romans. That was their lie. Things haven't changed much in politics, have they? The people were come to that degree of meanness and fear, and these robbers to that degree of madness, that these last took upon them to appoint high priests. So when they had disannulled the succession, according to those families out of which the high priests used to be made, they ordained certain unknown and ignoble persons for that office, that they might have their assistance in their wicked undertakings. For such as obtained this highest of all honors without any desert were forced to comply with those that bestowed it on them. I have heard said recently, in our own culture, in our own political situation, how do these people come to power? How do they get into office to do the crazy things that they're doing? And that's exactly the kind of thing we're seeing happen here in Jerusalem. These guys, they push themselves into the temple, They disannul, that means they stop the normal ascension of priests as they've always come through the line of Levi and Aaron, and they appoint their own priests. They said, we're going to appoint our own priests so we can tell them what we want them to tell us. It's just blatant hypocrisy, of course. Those men, Josephus says, made the temple of God a stronghold for them and a place whither they might resort in order to avoid the troubles they feared from the people. The sanctuary was now become a refuge and a shop of tyranny. These guys knew, well, if we're going to live like this and behave like this, we got to have some security from the regular people. They'll eventually rise up against us. So we got to have some kind of safety. And they used the temple of all places. Here's a model of the temple, as it were. You can see the inner court is where the Holy of Holies was, and the holy place, and that is a fortress all by itself. You can see it's got a wall around it that can be sealed off with high walls and ramparts, towers on the corners from which you can fight, throw down weapons, which is exactly what they did. And then there's the outer court, the large outer court with the wall around it. That could be a place of defense against anybody on the outside. What we'll eventually see is there is a faction in the inner court fighting the faction in the outer court that's fighting the faction on the outside of the temple walls. This is Jerusalem. So John and the zealots meet resistance. Now the people could no longer bear the insolence of this procedure, but did altogether run zealously in order to overthrow that tyranny. Of the high priests, Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, and Ananus, the son of Ananus, when they were at their assemblies, bitterly reproached the people for their sloth and excited them against the zealots. So you got this guy named Ananus, who is a high priest, and his son Jesus, who is also a high priest, and they're reprimanding the people for letting all this stuff get out of hand and letting these guys take over. Does that sound familiar? It kind of sounds like America today. Somebody, how did you let these guys get in charge, get in control? Well, that's what they did in Jerusalem. John, who's now with the zealots in the temple, invites the Idumeans to help him. Now, by this crafty speech, John made the zealots afraid, yet durst he not directly name what foreign assistance he meant, but in a covert way only intimated at the Idumeans, because nobody trusted those wicked Idumeans. But now that he might particularly irritate the leaders of the zealots, he calumniated Ananus. Calumniated. Everybody knows what calumniated means, don't you? I confess I had to look it up. It means he lied about him. Now, why Josephus didn't say he lied about Ananus, I don't know. But he said he calumniated. And because he did, I now have one more word in my vocabulary. So he lies about Ananus to get the zealots to invite in the Idumeans. Here's the lie. He said Ananus and his party, in order to secure their own dominion, had invited the Romans to come to them, for that also was part of John's lie. He's telling the zealots, the worst guys to tell this, or the best guys to tell this kind of information. Ananus wants to invite the Romans in so he can defeat you guys. And so that fires up the zealots to say, well, let's go ahead and invite in the Idumeans. It was resolved to call in the Idumeans. So they wrote a short letter to this effect, that Ananus had imposed on the people and was betraying their metropolis to the Romans. Bald-faced lie. Didn't happen. That they themselves had revolted from the rest and were in custody in the temple on account of the preservation of their liberty. Were they in custody in the temple? Well, no, they had taken the temple over because they were afraid of the people's response to their wickedness. So the Idumeans get the letter. It says these rulers, the Idumean, were greatly surprised at the contents of the letter and at what those that came with it farther told them. Because when they sent the letter, they sent it with messengers to, by their own words, say this letter is telling you the truth. Whereupon they ran about the nation like madmen and made proclamation that the people should come to war. So a multitude was suddenly gotten together, sooner indeed than the time appointed in the proclamation. And everybody caught up their arms in order to maintain the liberty of their metropolis, and 20,000 of them were put into battle array and came to Jerusalem. So Ananus and Jesus, the high priests who were trying to get John and the zealots out of the temple, look over the wall and they see the Idumeans coming with 20,000 armed men. And they said, no, you can't come in the city. We're not sure what your purpose and your intentions are. And this was about 3 pages of speech by Ananus, but at any rate, I didn't want to give you all that. So the Idumeans were in a rage. You're going to lock your gates against us? This is our town too, you know. So they didn't meet with a ready entrance into the city, and they were enraged. But Simon, the son of Kessler, one of their commanders, with much ado, quieted the tumult of his own men and stood up so that the high priest might hear him, and said as follows: I can no longer wonder that the patrons of liberty are under custody in the temple. Catch that? Who's under custody in the temple? The patrons of liberty, the real patriots of Israel, who are just the zealot robbers who took the temple because they didn't want people to stop them. He goes on to say, since there are those that shut the gates of our common city to their own nation, and at the same time are prepared to admit the Romans into it. Bald-faced lie. Wasn't going to happen, but that's what they were told. That's what they believed. So they, the zealots, secretly went out of the temple to the wall of the city and made use of their saws and opened that gate which was over against the Idumeans. See, the zealots had invited the Idumeans, and the citizens and the high priests had stopped the Idumeans from getting into town. What I'm not telling you is what Josephus records. That night there was a huge thunderstorm, lightning, heavy wind, lots of rain. And so the Idumeans are on the outside, and they're being pummeled by this wind and rain, and they're wet and they're cold, and they're getting angrier by the minute because of how they're being shut out from the town. Well, the zealots take this opportunity with all this noise and commotion to go out at night with equipment that they stole from the temple, and they cut through the doors, and they let the Idumeans come in. So that's what's happening. At first, there came a fear upon the Idumeans themselves, which disturbed them, as imagining that Ananus and his party were coming out to attack them, so that every one of them had his right hand upon his sword in order to defend himself. But they soon came to know who they were that came to them, and were entered into the city, 20,000 armed Idumeans ready to kill somebody. Nor did the Idumeans spare anybody, for as they are naturally a most barbarous and bloody nation, they made use of their weapons, insomuch that they ran through those with their swords who desired them to remember the relation that there was between them. We're brothers. Jews and Idumeans are brothers, but, sorry about that, had no effect to stop them what they were going to do. They were driven one upon another in heaps, so were they slain. Thus the greater part were driven together by force, as there was now no place of retirement, no place to run, no place to go. And the murderers were upon them, and having no other way, threw themselves down headlong into the city. They're throwing themselves off the wall down to the lower parts of town below, whereby, in my opinion, they underwent a more miserable destruction than that which they avoided, because that was a voluntary one. And now the outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood, and that day as it came on, they saw 8,500 dead bodies there. But the rage of the Idumeans was not satiated by these slaughters. They now betook themselves to the city and plundered every house and slew everyone they met. And for the other multitude, they esteemed it needless to go on with killing them, but they sought for the high priests, and the generality went through the greatest zeal against them. And as soon as they caught them, they slew them, and then standing upon their dead bodies in way of jest, they upbraided Ananus. In other words, the Idumeans came in, and they were going through town, just entering houses and wiping people out. And the zealots thought, all right, this is our opportunity to find the high priests and kill them. So that's what they have done. I should not mistake if I said, says Josephus, that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city, and that from this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs. Whereupon they saw their high priest and the procurer of their preservation slain in the midst of their city. So there's a Roman war council. I had a spy sneak in and get this picture, and so he got all the Roman generals and Vespasian here. Vespasian's commanders, they said, let's attack while the Jews are fighting each other. This would be a great time to attack. But Vespasian says, no way. If we attack them right now, that would cause them to unite together to fight against us. So he says, let's just let them fight. As a matter of fact, he says, God acts as a general of the Romans better than he could do. What kind of a statement is that? Here are heathen pagan Romans attacking the city of David, Jerusalem, and the Jews are wiping themselves out with seditions And Vespasian knows this, and he says, God's doing a better job of wiping out his people than we could do. Jerusalem's troubles get worse and worse. Many there were of the Jews that deserted every day and fled away from the zealots, although their flight was very difficult, since they had guarded every passage out of the city, and they slew everyone that was caught at them, as taking it for granted that they were going over to the Romans. So you try to get out of town to escape all this murder, all this violence, and there's somebody waiting at every place you might try to get out, and they think, well, if you're trying to get out, you must be going to the Romans, so we'll kill you right here. But these zealots came at last to that degree of barbarity as not to bestow a burial either on those slain in the city or on those that lay along the roads. They left the dead bodies to putrefy under the sun, and the same punishment was allotted to such as buried any as to those that deserted, which was no other than death, while he that granted the favor of a grave to another would presently stand in need of a grave himself. To say all in a word, no other gentle passion was so entirely lost among them as mercy. Imagine your loved one being murdered and laying out in the open, and you want to just go recover the body and give it a burial, and if you do that, they'll see you as an enemy and kill you as well. Couldn't even bury your loved ones. That is something that will come up later, but I didn't include that again because we'd already talked about it here. Now there arose another war at Jerusalem. There was a son of Jeorah, one Simon by birth of Gerazah, a young man, and not so cunning indeed as John, who had already seized upon the city, but superior in strength of body and courage. He came to those robbers who had seized upon Masada. You may have heard of Masada. It's a fortress, an elevated fortress outside of Jerusalem, and some had taken refuge there. And so this guy, Simon, goes to Masada. And when he gets there, he excites them to war against the Romans. And he was exercising his men beforehand and making preparations for the assault of Jerusalem. We're going to go to Jerusalem and save it from the Romans. Though they, the zealots, were afraid to fight him, Simon, openly in a fair battle, yet did they lay ambushes in the passes and seized upon his wife with a considerable number of her attendants. Whereupon they came back to the city, rejoicing as if they had taken Simon himself captive. So Simon comes to the wall of Jerusalem, and like wild beasts when they're wounded and cannot overtake those that wounded them, he vented his spleen upon all persons that he met with. He's so mad because they captured his wife that he's going to kill everybody he finds. Accordingly, he caught all those who were come out of the city gates, either to gather herbs or sticks, who were unarmed and in years, older people. He then tormented them, he tortured them, he abused them, and destroyed them out of the immense rage he was in, and was almost ready to taste the very flesh of their dead bodies. He also cut off the hands of a great many and sent them into the city to astonish his enemies. Hey, you want to see how bad I am? Let me cut these people's hands off. Now you go back into town and show them how I've cut your hands off. That's the kind of people we're talking about. As soon as Simon had set his wife free and recovered her from the zealots, he returned back to the remainders of Idumea, and driving the nation all before him from all quarters, he compelled a great number of them to retire to Jerusalem. He followed them himself also to the city and encompassed the wall round again. And when he light upon any laborers that were coming thither out of that country, he slew them. Now this Simon, who was without the wall, that means outside the wall, was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves, as were the zealots who were within the wall or inside the wall, more heavy upon them than both of the other. During this time did the mischievous contrivances and courage of John corrupt the body of the Galileans, for these Galileans had advanced this John and made him very potent. He permitted them to do all things that any of them desired to do, while their inclination to plunder was insatiable, as was their zeal in searching the houses of the rich, and for the murdering of the men and abusing of the women, it was sport to them. It's just escalating and getting worse and worse. However, Simon waited for such as ran away from John. Simon's the one on the outside, remember? And things are getting really bad because John's firing up the people. Hey, you know, if you want, you can go out, you can pillage the houses of the rich. Go anywhere you want, murder anybody you want. And that's what John was doing. So people are trying to get out of town, and when they do, they meet with Simon, who's on the outside. He was more bloody of the two, and he who had escaped the tyrant within the wall was destroyed by the other that lay before the gates, so that all attempts of flying and deserting to the Romans were cut off, as to those that had a mind to do so. Don't ask if things can get worse. Josephus says it was God who turned their opinions to the worst advice, and thence they devised such a remedy to get themselves free as was worse than the disease itself. Accordingly, in order to overthrow John, who had taken over the temple, they determined to admit Simon. Accordingly, he, in an arrogant manner, granted them his lordly protection and came into the city in order to deliver it from the zealots. The people also made joyful acclamations to him as their Savior and their preserver, but when he was come in with his army, he took care to secure his own authority and looked upon those that had invited him to be no less his enemies than those against whom the invitation was intended. So now, Simon is not outside, he's inside town. So he, Eleazar, son of John, John's overtaken the temple, and his son Eleazar desires to have some power of his own, so he revolts from Dad, followed by a great many of the zealots. These seized upon the inner court of the temple and laid their arms upon the holy gates and over the holy fronts of that court. And because they had plenty of provisions, they were of good courage, for there was great abundance of what was consecrated to sacred uses, and they scrupled not the making use of them. All the stores, when the people brought in the tenth, their tithes, that's where they were stored, in this area. And so when they took this area of the temple, they had all those sacred stores that people had brought to worship God. And they did whatever they wanted with them. There were continual sallies made one against another, as well as darts thrown at one another, and the temple was defiled everywhere with murders. But now the tyrant Simon, the son of Gioras, whom the people had invited in, did now make more vehement assaults upon John and his party, because these were fought against from above also. In other words, Eleazar's got the higher inner court, and he's throwing stuff down at John. And Simon's on the outside of the temple, but he's in the town, and he's attacking, trying to get over the wall to John. And there's just stuff being thrown all over the place. They fought against from above also, yet was he beneath their situation when he attacked them, as they were beneath the attacks of the others above them. For those darts that were thrown by the engines, the word engine just means like they had a huge, like a crossbow, and they could put rocks on it or arrows, logs, anything they wanted to hurl that over, and they had things like catapults, all kinds of engines of war to throw things, large things, heavy things. It says they came with that force as they went over all the buildings and reached as far as the altar and the temple itself, and fell upon the priests. Because while all this is going on, the priesthood's still trying to do their job, and people are still coming to Jerusalem to worship. And so they're trying to make their way into the temple to offer up their sacrifices, and there's a war going on. Insomuch that many persons who came thither with great zeal from the ends of the earth to offer sacrifices at this celebrated place, which was esteemed holy by all mankind, fell down before their own sacrifices themselves and sprinkled that altar which was venerable among all men, both Greeks and barbarians, with their own blood, till the dead bodies of strangers were mingled together with those of their own country, and those of profane persons with those of the priests. And the blood of all sorts of dead carcasses stood in lakes in the holy courts themselves. He, John, sallied out with a great number upon Simon and his party, till he set on fire those houses that were full of corn and all other provisions. Well, that's a great idea. The Romans are on their way to surround our city and lay siege to us. Let's go over here and burn the food stores of our enemies. That's a great idea. The same thing was done by Simon when upon the others' retreat, he counterattacked the city also, as if they had on purpose done it to serve the Romans by destroying that the city had laid up against the siege, and that almost all the corn was burnt, which would have been sufficient for a siege of many years. So they were taken by means of the famine, which it was impossible that they should have been unless they had thus prepared the way for it by this procedure. And on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Eleazar and his party, who had control of the main part of the temple, opened the gates and admitted such of the people as were desirous to worship God into it. But John, made use of this festival as a cloak for his treacherous designs, and armed the most inconsiderable of his own party with weapons concealed under their garments, and sent them with great zeal into the temple in order to seize upon it. Which armed men, when they were gotten in, threw their garments away, and presently appeared in their armor. The people that stood trembling at the altar and about the holy house were rolled on heaps together and trampled upon, and were beaten both with wooden and iron weapons without mercy. Just imagine that. Next time we come to church, there's a bunch of guys here wearing long coats. And what are these guys in long coats? And just before the sermon starts, because they wouldn't wait till after the sermon, of course, they open their coats and they're covered with weapons and they start attacking everybody. That's the kind of thing that's happening here. Josephus has an opinion here that he wants to lay down. He says, it's therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries. Do you think he knew what Jesus had said? This is what Josephus is saying of himself. Nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. Finally, they brought the Hebrew nation into contempt, that they might themselves appear comparatively less impious with regard to strangers. They confessed what was true, that they were the slaves, the scum, and the spurious and abortive offspring of our nation. Whew. Just a little bit of vehemence there. Titus, finally, the Roman general, Titus is the son of Vespasian. Vespasian has gone back to take care of some political things. Nero has died, trouble in Alexandria, so Vespasian leaves and Titus comes, and he's now about to lay siege to the city. He says that therefore his opinion was that if they aimed at quickness, they wanted to get this done fast, joined with security quickly and safely, they must build a wall around the entire city, which was, he thought, the only way to prevent the Jews from coming out anyway. And that then they would either entirely despair of saving the city and so would surrender it up to him, or be still more easily conquered when the famine had farther weakened them. In other words, Titus literally employed his soldiers to build a wall, come out from the wall of Jerusalem and build another wall. So if you tried to get out of Jerusalem, what you had a wall to get to the Romans. So all hopes of escaping was now cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city. Then did the famine widen its progress and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine. And the lanes of the city were full of the dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with the famine and fell down dead wheresoever their misery seized them. As for burying them, those that were sick themselves were not able to do it. Those who were hearty and well were deterred from doing it by the great multitude of those dead bodies, and by the uncertainty there was how soon that they would die themselves. For many died as they were burying others. Nor was there any lamentations made under these calamities, nor were heard any mournful complaints. But the famine confounded all natural passions. For those who were just going to die looked upon those that were gone to rest before them with dry eyes and open mouths. Pretty bleak picture. Now the seditious at first gave orders that the dead should be buried out of the public treasury, as not enduring the stench of their dead bodies. But afterwards, when they could not do that, they had them cast down from the walls into the valleys beneath. So the Romans are outside the city. They're on their wall, and they're watching Jerusalem, and the Jews are throwing their dead people off the walls down into the floor beneath. When Titus, the Roman general, son of Vespasian, in going around his rounds along these valleys, saw them full of dead bodies and the thick putrefaction running about them, he gave a groan, and spreading out his hands to heaven, called God to witness that this was not his doing. And such was the sad case of the city itself. But the Romans, the soldiers, were very joyful, since none of the seditious could now make sallies out of the city, because they were themselves disconsolate, and the famine already touched them also. Hereupon some of the deserters, having no other way, leaped down from the wall immediately, while others of them went out of the city with stones, as if they would fight them. But hereupon they fled away to the Romans. And here a worse fate accompanied these than what they had found within the city. and they met with a quicker dispatch from the too great abundance they had among the Romans. Because somebody finally would get out and get to the Romans, and the Romans, all right, we'll take you in as a slave. This guy needs some food. Give him some food, and he would eat so much that his body would explode. From too great abundance that they had that they could have done from the famine among the Jews. For when they came first to the Romans, they were puffed up by the famine and swelled like men in a dropsy, after which they all on a sudden overfilled those bodies that were before empty, and so burst asunder. Yet did another plague seize upon those that were thus preserved. For there was found among the Syrian deserters a certain person who was caught gathering pieces of gold out of the excrements of the Jews' bellies. For the deserters used to swallow such pieces of gold, as we told you before, when they came out, and for these did the seditious search them all. But when this contrivance was discovered in one instance, the fame of it filled their several camps, that the deserters came to them full of gold. So the multitude of the Arabians with the Syrians cut up those that came as supplicants and searched their bellies. Nor does it seem to me that any misery befell the Jews that was more terrible than this, since in one night's time about 2,000 of these deserters were thus dissected. What's happening? They're finally finding a way out to go to that Roman wall and make their escape to the Romans. Whatever their fate would be, it can't be worse than what's happening in town, but to secure some kind of provision for themselves, they would swallow gold pieces. And when that was discovered, the Roman guards, who weren't all Romans, as this says, some of them were Arabians who'd been conscripted into the Roman army, and Syrians, they start cutting these people up. Of those that perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell fighting with one another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond Jordan. Her name was Mary, ironically. The other effects of this woman had been already seized upon. They stole all her stuff, all of her food, and they kept coming back into her place and taking whatever she could gather after that. What she had treasured up besides, as also what food she had contrived to save, had been also carried off by the rapacious guards. And it was now become impossible for her in any way to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow. She then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, which was a child sucking at her breast, she said, "O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? Come on, be thou my food." As soon as she had said this, she slew her son, and then roasted him, and eat the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. Upon this, the seditious came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten already. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with an horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight, when she said to them, "This is mine own son, and what hath been done was mine own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself. Do not you pretend to be either more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother. But if you be so scrupulous, and do abominate this my sacrifice, as I have eaten the one half, let the rest be reserved for me also." After which those men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted at anything as they were at this. And with some difficulty they left the rest of that meat to the mother. Upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately. Word spread that this had happened. And while everybody laid this miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled as if this unheard of action had been done by themselves. So those that were thus distressed by the famine were very desirous to die, and those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough to either hear or to see such miseries. What about those who survived all of this? Caesar slew all those that had been seditious, all those that fought against them, all the robbers. But of the young men, he chose out the tallest and most beautiful and reserved them for the triumph. They took them back to Rome and made a big parade through the streets and showed what they'd captured. As for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beasts. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. The number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000. The greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, but not belonging to the city. They were Jewish, but they weren't all citizens of Jerusalem. For they were come up from all the country to the feast of the unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at very first occasioned so great a straitness among them, that they were come as a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly. Now, as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none to be the objects of their fury, Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and the temple, which is what Jesus said. The temple would be demolished. No stone would be left on another. This was the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations. A city otherwise of great magnificence and of mighty fame throughout among all mankind. When Josephus says innovations, he's not talking about the kind we think of today. He's talking about the innovation of rebelling against the Romans. Here's the epilogue. I thought this was interesting. When Titus was come into the city, he admired not only some other places of strength in it, but particularly those strong towers which the tyrants in their mad conduct had relinquished. For when he saw their solid altitude, how high they were, and the largeness of their several stones, and the exactness of their joints, how well they were fit together, and the hugeness of their stone, and also how great was their breadth and how extensive their length, he expressed himself after the manner following: We have certainly had God for our assistant in this war, and it was no other than God who ejected the Jews out of these fortifications. For what could the hands of men or any machines do towards overthrowing these towers? That is what Titus said when he finally got into Jerusalem. Why this lesson? Why did I put all this together? Jesus said, tribulation like's never been or like never will be. And then there's a historian who wrote particularly about this destruction. And we've only seen a part of it in this. If you were to read this yourself, you were to go to Josephus and read the rest of it, you'll say, why did Marty put that in? Why didn't he put that? Was horrible. Why didn't he put that in? The part about they had so many guys crucified outside the wall that they didn't have enough trees to make crosses out of. Anyway, more stuff happened that I didn't put in here, but this is enough, I think, to let us know that when God comes in judgment, he comes seriously and he exacts his justice. I think about Jerusalem as a city that rejected his son, and now this is the quintessential picture of what happens to those who reject his son. Aren't you glad to be here tonight? To be among those who honor Jesus Christ as the Son of God. I know this isn't happy and this isn't the normal kind of lesson we hear, my goodness. But this is unique. And if anybody ought to be hearing these things, it should probably be us, I think. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're so grateful to you. We know that because of our sin, we all deserve to die. But because of our faith, you've given us life and you've prepared a home for us in heaven. We can't wrap our minds around, at least I can't, all that happened to Jerusalem. But I understand that this was your doing. This was your response to evil. And I pray that for myself and for all of us here tonight, we will understand just how much you hate sin, how much you hate evil, how much you love us, and how much you want to save us from that sin and from that evil. Help us, Lord, to appreciate how wonderful you are and how gracious and how merciful towards those who put their faith in you. I surely wish that your people had done that back then, and I understand why your son cried and wept when he came to Jerusalem. Thank you, Lord, for this bit of history and for leaving it for us to read today. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to stand and sing a song of encouragement. I think we might need a little encouragement right now. At any rate, if you would like to talk about becoming a Christian or need the prayers of this congregation, that's what this invitation is for. So please come forward while we sing, and we'll do everything we can to help you.